Hello YouTube. So I realized I've been doing a lot of videos where there was either an atheist talking to a theist, or specifically a monotheist, because atheists talking to polytheists and monotheists talking to polytheists are incredibly rare, and realized I was doing a lot of videos which were debates between atheists and more secular, sort of psychologically oriented theists. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that I feel like atheists need the most help these days. Not that there aren't plenty of Christians who are, and just generally other theists who are in error. I mean, they're plenty in error, but the thing is with atheists is they're so far off of what's actually going on. Because they've basically been misled by the new atheist model that has sort of propagated over the internet, in the same way that sort of Christianity, or specific interpretation of Christianity, propagated over the medieval world. Except, it's far less helpful. It's far further off of the mark of what's really going on in this world. So I feel like, to the extent that I can help people, I want to help the atheistic people come online in 2023 so they can get out of 1780 that a lot of them seem stuck in. But this being said, there are while the symbolic is sort of being carried as a torch by the Christians right now, because there are just a lot of Christians in the West. It's probably the most popular thing in the West. The symbolic world is being carried by them, basically. Because if you're getting into symbols, the first symbol set that you're going to run into is the one that was most popular before materialism took over, in its brief little Industrial Revolution run into the information era. But there's some problems with trying to resurrect the old world style of Christianity, and by old world I mean like 1300s 1400s style Christianity, in the information era that we're currently in. Some of that is functional, some of it not so functional. And so I want to spend some time over on the theist side of the equation, and that presents some issues, because a lot of theistic arguments have not, in the information era, have not had time to adapt, so they're kind of half-baked. There have been some good theistic arguments that I've heard. Stephen Meyer has some really good arguments, and I like him because he doesn't go too far. He doesn't let his pre-existing beliefs carry him away into like, he can have his personal beliefs, that's fine, but he's very careful about knowing what he can actually prove and articulate. He doesn't abuse first principles like some other people do, like William Lane Craig or whoever. Just uses first principles to death, makes them do way too much work than they need to. And of course, there are other people in the Christian world who are just so polemic, like Frank Turek and all these people who are, they're beating up on college kids who don't understand what to do when somebody's like manipulating data or playing with first principles or citing bad historical arguments or all this stuff. They don't really understand how to deal with that, so they'll perform to an audience of 20-year-olds and like crush them with like master's degree philosophy semantics. So I'm not gonna really waste time on any of those people unless I really feel like I have to, because they're a pretty small margin of the Christian community, and I don't find them particularly engaging or interesting. Probably William Lane Craig is the one who I think people could learn the most from of that particular crowd, because his semantic tricks are, some of them firstly aren't tricks, they're actually good arguments, but secondly, some of his semantic tricks are actually worth considering. Now, one of the more interesting Christian thinkers that I've seen is Johnathan Pageau, because Johnathan Pageau is actually very well versed in postmodern philosophy and like 1900 or not 1900 yeah 1900s philosophy. Like he has read Foucault and Derrida and all these people. He actually understands the philosophy of the 1900s, which is way more than most atheists understand. Now, he can be a little opaque at times and hard to follow for some people, but I think I can follow most of his arguments pretty well. And he actually came to a parallel system of symbolic representation that I came to, but his is a little different, and I guess we could explore that. I actually haven't seen this video in its entirety. It's called Reenchantment Now, Fairies, Aliens, the Occult, Praying, and some other thing with Seraphim Hamilton. I believe a seraphim is a form of angel. I'm not sure if that's his actual name or not. If it is, then that's has interesting implications, and if it's not, then that also has interesting implications. But regardless, I guess let's just get right into it, and I'll see what I can glean from this, and I'll provide feedback when I feel like I ought to. So let's kick it off.
This is Johnathan Pageau. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
I do want to say that's just an incredibly beautiful intro. That's kudos to whoever did that, seriously.
So hello everyone, this is Seraphim Hamilton, and today I'm very excited to have Johnathan Pageau back on the channel. My last video with Johnathan was one of the most viewed long-form videos on this channel, so I know people got a lot out of it, and I definitely did as well, so welcome back.
It's great to see you again, Seraphim. Always great to talk to you.
You too. So I want to talk today about a lot of things, really, but I'm going to start by returning to this theme of universal history, which you've produced a huge amount of content on. And I want to connect that a little bit to your recent work on Snow White. And so let me just ask you this question. What is the connection between the universal history of real, quote-unquote, nations, Ethiopia, America, Israel, and unreal or fictional narratives? How do those two things intersect, and what does that mean for the significance of symbolism in universal history?
Well, what happens, I think, the way to understand it is that what happens with universal history in some ways is that the way that things are remembered at the origin, especially at the origin of something, they tend to have a certain form. They tend to contract towards in certain directions, towards something we could call mythological storytelling, which is that the tropes become more and more condensed, and you find things that we don't usually find in everyday life when you look, especially the further you go back into the past. So if you look at early chronicles, it's always like giants and dragons and hybrid kings and all of this stuff that seems a little crazy to us. And I think that studying fairy tales can help us understand why it is that things get remembered that way, and why and what importance they have. Some of the images and some of the tropes have an analogical coherence, you could say, that can help us understand why our universal histories look the way they do, and then to some extent also why those patterns happen in scripture as well, similar patterns as to what happened in the fairy tales. Of course, in scripture we're talking about a different level of reality. We don't want to compare scripture and fairy tales too much, but to some extent we can, in the sense that they seem to capture similar themes, as the fairy tales seem to capture similar themes than what you find especially in the Old Testament.
So as far as I can tell, the universal history thing that he's talking about, the universal history concept, he's talking about archetypes emerging out of historical analysis, which is quite true. So history is not a camera. You're not videotaping history from some omniscient point of view. When you're looking at history, you're looking at what people remember, and some people might think that what people remember is material reality as such, but that's impossible because there's too much of it and most of it's completely irrelevant. So people remember what's relevant. They remember it best in forms of stories that center on individuals and specific things those individuals do. So if you distill that enough over a long enough time period, you get mythology and religions. Now, I would say that mythology and religions are slightly different. And so he did say that you don't want to compare like fairy tales and religion too much, and I think there's a really good reason for that I might get into later. But so far, I'm in pretty much violent agreement with him.
Yeah, and what do you mean? There's been a recent, I've noticed, focus from a lot of different people on this idea of a haunted universe or a universe which is more populous than we're familiar with thinking of it. And I know reading Saint Porphyrios, it was very interesting to me. There's a story where someone is talking to him and he's asking him, is there life on other planets? Are there aliens? And he says, why are you even asking me about life on other planets? Do you know just how much stuff there is around us right now that you have no idea exists? And I just thought that was so interesting because Saint Porphyrios is one of those saints who has, you might say, relatively unique spiritual gifts in that he was able to see lots of different things in the material world and the non-material world which aren't accessible to us or even to a lot of other saints. And that was just fascinating to me in terms of this new kind of excitement, a relatively new excitement about a more populous universe. So when we talk about fairy tales, obviously we're talking in part about fairies. Yeah. So do you think that, at what point do we say that there is kind of a genuine, concrete reference to beings that we might call fairies?
Yeah. So let me back up a little bit and try to, I think, kind of contextualize what's happening in terms of this new interest in, like you said, a more populous universe. One of the things that happened, of course, in 19th century materialism was the evacuation of agency in the cosmos as superstition, right? The idea that every time you see agency in the cosmos or that you see other consciousness acting in the cosmos, it's just superstition and projection, that's the type of word they use. But that type of thinking, this materialist type of thinking, was never didn't come to the point of trying to account for our consciousness and our agency. And they were just ignoring it as this kind of blind spot from a point of view where they looked on the world with that agency and consciousness, but then used their reason and their agency and consciousness to evacuate the rest of the universe of agency and consciousness. And so I think that we've come to a point where even a lot of scientists and a lot of, especially scientists that study cognition, they're realizing that this is a ridiculous position to stand in. It's a ridiculous position to ignore the categories of consciousness when we're literally using those categories to evacuate the cosmos of consciousness.
Yep, this is exactly what I was talking about in my atheism is a belief system video. So you have a belief system, you take it on faith that the methodological naturalism of the world is true, but what are you taking that on faith with? You're taking that on faith with your mind. And so you have to construct an a priori theory of consciousness that, like he said, evacuates the cosmos of agency and meaning. And the funny thing is, if you admit that you have agency and meaning, then what does that say about the universe that spawned you?
So I think that's the point where we've come to, where now there are people, very reasonable, people that aren't Christian, that are atheists or secular or all kinds of people that are willing and in some ways realize that using categories of agency and consciousness to understand certain phenomena is actually more useful than the kind of cold analytical description that they're used to, especially for understanding social movements, for understanding kind of large scale transformations, using things like agency to explain those. When people use the term egregore, they use different, they use things like emergence, words like emergence. In some ways, it doesn't matter to us at the outset what words they use, but they're noticing something like intelligent patterns kind of coming back and manifesting themselves on the world.
So far, in violent agreement. Is this man a polytheist? What's going on here?
So once you've crossed that threshold, and this is the funny thing that a lot of people don't realize, once they cross that threshold and they ride that out consistently, they will find themselves once again in a world of jinns and fairies and intermediary beings. And I think that you're seeing a lot of people talk about re-enchantment. You know, you have Rod Dreher. I've just read an article by Mary Harrington today that tries to talk about re-enchantment. People taking mushrooms, talking about all these beings that they meet and everything. And I think that that's the future. If you want to know what the future is, that's it. But it's a scary, it's not that great of a future. It's scary because without order, without the Logos, you know, ordering that world for us, then it's a very scary and dangerous world to walk through.
Okay, here we go. So this is the part that I figured we would get to. So far, I'm completely, everything he says checks out from a metaphysical, a scientific, a modern perspective. So when he says that's the future, he's 100% right. Where his favoritism toward his particular belief system starts coming in is when he says the Logos, right? And by Logos, he has this whole string of beliefs and attachments connected to this thing he calls the Logos. And he has all these stories about it and all these belief systems. And by Logos, what I'm pretty sure he means, and I maybe he'll get into it later and I can stand corrected, is a personal incarnation of the singular monotheistic force that created the universe and came down with a very specific teleology and purpose and reshaped history and blah blah blah. Now, that's a huge, huge, huge claim. So when you're talking about emergent patterns of being and all these different beings having particular amounts of agency and these sort of groups or egregores, as he was talking about, having agency, that makes sense. But when you come and you start saying, like, you know, it's one thing to say that there are gods and gods are this and it's an emergent quality of nature. All that's, I think, completely verifiable from a certain perspective. What I don't find to be verifiable is saying that, okay, on top of that, there's this this hierarchy that is, because my book said so, that there's this son of God or whatever that came down and does very specific things for a very specific purpose, and this is the teleology of the entire cosmos converging toward this one point in history. That, to me, seems presumptuous. But I don't know. Maybe he'll find some evidence for it. One thing I do agree with, though, in what he said, is that if you enter that world of spirits, of forms, let's say, the idealist, really it's an idealistic world plus agency. It's Platonic idealism with agency involved. So if you enter that world, that metaphysical overlay that exists all the time that they're talking about, initially it's scary because it's like you're going into the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon rainforest, you get lost. There's all types of crazy monsters and, you know, jaguars and fire ants, and like you're afraid. You're psychically afraid when you first enter that. But this being said, if you are intelligent and critical / maybe have some good guides, if you aren't that intelligent or critical, maybe you have somebody helping you through this like a guru helping you through this, you can begin to understand the landscape. So there are some really good books about entering the spirit world that are mythological, obviously, but have some really good symbolic representations of this. The Tiffany Aching series, specifically the first book, is really, really good, by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett has an unfailing imagination, imaginary mind, so he can really tap into that world and sort of express it in a way that is functional to people. The alchemists called this state of initial fear upon examining the unconscious the Negrito, which means the darkness, basically. And there were other stages past that, and, you know, they weren't necessarily dependent on your faith in the risen Jew god or whatever. Like, it's you can my point is, you can impose order on that state without being a Christian. And in fact, being a Christian because you're sort of holed up in your own little metaphysical corner of the world, most of them are, and you're trained and neurolinguistically programmed, most of them, to be terrified of this space. When you finally break into this space, which is there waiting for you, you're going to shit your pants because you have been... It's like the opposite of good spiritual training. Like Christianity, in most cases, is the opposite of good spiritual training because they tell you to be afraid of the thing that goes bump in the night. Not that you can understand this thing and it has motivations that aren't just murder and death and gore, and like you can actually enter relationships with these things that are beneficial, mutually beneficial, in fact. So we'll see what... I'm presuming a lot about the simplicity of what they believe, but let's move along.
So I think that fairy tales are a way to help people reaccustom themselves with these types of patterns.
It was really interesting to me that you just mentioned the danger of meeting these things apart from the logos, and then mentioned fairy tales again, because I remember in That Hideous Strength, which is called a modern fairy tale or a fairy tale for grown-ups, That Hideous Strength has this wonderful scene where Jane encounters Venus, and she goes into her room and she sees this burning woman, and it absolutely terrifies her. And when she goes to Ransom and talks about it, he tells her, well, you've met Venus, but you've met Venus kind of naked. You've met her apart from Melinda or Christ in this story.
Okay, so there's a lot I could say here, but this feels quite Freudian. And not necessarily in a good way. This feels like a form of projection. So it is true that... See, the thing is, I don't know what they mean by Christ, and that it's really bugging me. Because if they mean the dude who was allegedly a mythological sage 2,000 years ago, I don't even know what they mean by meeting Venus in the absence of Christ. Obviously, Venus is a love goddess or a lust goddess, depending on the level that you view her at. But if you see... If you're... Let's say they're on a mushroom trip, right? Let's just imagine for the sake... Because people do meet these entities on mushroom trips. If you meet Venus, which is basically an embodiment of female sexuality on a mushroom trip, and you see it burst into flames, that is your problem. That is not Venus's problem. That's your problem because you are afraid of your own sexuality. Like, if you had a dream, let's leave the mushrooms out of it, because I know somebody's going to say that, no, they're schizophrenic and what you see on mushrooms isn't real. If you have a dream of... You see this hot woman, this perfect woman, this beautiful woman, whatever's the most beautiful woman to you, assuming you're into that, assuming you like women. And you see this beautiful woman, this object of desire, and then you see it burst into flames. Does that sound like something a psychologically healthy person would see? Or does that sound like something a neurotic person who believes that if they give in to their sexual desires in any capacity, they're going to go to hell for eternity believes? This is not particularly helpful. If you like, this is what I was talking about Christians shitting their pants when they enter the symbolic world. If you, like I said, now there are obviously ways that you could interact with Venus and have your relationship with Venus, which is basically just the egregore of sexuality, go very badly. For instance, if you just are disrespectful, if you're a slut, basically, then you are going to have a rough time. But, like, that's not to say that, like, you should have this relationship where you see it bursting into flames. Whatever right relationship with sexuality looks like, something tells me that these guys are not particularly qualified to talk about that.
And I think that idea really rolls together with a lot of things we read about in Scripture, especially I think in Galatians, where what life looks like outside of Christ is you are enslaved or subjected to these powers which are external to you.
Yeah, see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what these deities are. So, when they're talking about being enslaved or subjected to something external to you, okay, firstly, the number one rule of Hermeticism is as above, so below, and the rejoinder to that is as within, so without. So, what does that mean in terms of like your relationship with these principalities and powers, these core gods and goddesses? That means that you are in them and they are in you. It doesn't mean that they're external and like outside of you imposing their will. That's his idea of what a Christian God does, coming into his relationship with trying to understand these powers and principalities, which can actually be verified to exist in a certain framework. Now, the source of being that he talks about it having certain attributes. And if it truly is the source of being, then it gave rise to everything, including these powers and principalities, so they are part of it as well. Now, they reconcile that with some BS about fallen angels or whatever, and like... but the thing is, in my understanding of it, saying a fallen god makes no sense. People can have these things are... People can have a relationship with them that goes against their best interest, and they can have a relationship with it that goes in their best interest. And it's up to those people to really make that decision. This concept of like... Yeah, see, I just don't even know what they mean when they're talking like this. Like, these things are external. It's like, is lust external to you? Do you really think lust is external to you? Because all that seems to me is that you're projecting it out into the world and you're refusing to take responsibility for your actions. Like, if somebody is a slut and they say, oh, well, I was possessed by the goddess of lust or whatever, or a demon of lust, I'm going to look at them and say, you are a demon of lust. Now get your shit together.
You are considered just as kind of a part of a kind of wild world, whereas in Christ, humanity is really born so that humanity stands, in relation to the world as its Lord, Master, and Bridegroom.
Utter horse shit. You are capable, like, the human capacity to order the world in a certain way is not related to any external deity. The human capacity to order the world is based on how human beings are made in the image of all of these forces.
Because of the incarnation of the Word, who structures all of these different things. So I know that's
No, I think you're totally right, and we can talk about it in different ways, especially for people who might struggle to understand this, because obviously when you say something like that, as you and I who've been thinking about this forever, it just makes sense. When secular people hear something like that, they just hear woo, they just like see the wildness and craziness, and so one of the things that I've been trying to do is obviously to bridge these two worlds, that people understand what the hell we're talking about. And I think that understanding, for example, virtues and vices, it's a completely traditional Christian way to help people understand how agency acts on us, and how, depending on how we approach certain agencies that are acting on us and through us, then they can either be liberating and pointing towards Christ, or they can simultaneously be tyrants that rule over us. And so if you think of a let's say of a virtue like courage, that is definitely a virtue if it's pointed in the right direction, if you're courageous for the right reasons. But then the same virtue can become a kind of prideful, irascibility that can trap you and that can make you its slave if it's not pointed towards something higher, if it's not pointed to something else.
Okay, so this particularly is something that I can sort of get behind. It's just that I take issue with the him using this, inserting his own personal like the word Christ has a lot of baggage, right? The word logos has a lot of baggage. And it has this so basically what he's saying is that, like, all right, let me phrase it like this. In polytheism, generally speaking, there is the concept of, outside of the deities, of malefic and benefic. The malefic entities are essentially things that are unpleasant to people, but are not necessarily, I mean, there's nothing evil in polytheism. What there is things that don't work well over a long time span. They don't iterate well if you act them out, and things that are unpleasant and sort of frustrating to people that stand in people's way by imposing limitations and discomfort on them that are ultimately necessary. So the classic malefics are Mars and Jupiter. Or no, sorry, Mars and Saturn. So what is Saturn? Law, limitation, frustration, death and taxes. Saturn is death and taxes. What is Mars? War, combat, physical exercise, male sexuality, verbal combat, arguments. So these things are necessary. Death is necessary. Verbal combat, arguments, war, bombs, guns, these things are necessary. Because if you don't have them and somebody else does, they walk over you. Laws are necessary. They keep society in check. And if we didn't die, then the world would be overrun, overpopulated by an infinite amount of creatures, and that wouldn't work. So, yeah, all of these things, but these things are unpleasant. They carry weight and consequences to us. And the major benefics are Venus and Jupiter. But it's important to realize that in polytheism, those benefics are not all good. Just like nothing is all good or all bad. Things have these... things are defined as good or bad in relation to each other. And just because something is pleasant and wants to give you a gift does not necessarily mean that that gift comes with no cost. So, you know, Venus is pleasure, food, music, sex, all these happy things, comfort, all this. But, you know, if you have too much of that, it's like eating chocolate cake until you puke. And, you know, so these things have to be in right relation to each other. They have to iterate well. And then on top of that, there's things that are uncomfortable to people and unpleasant to people, but are nonetheless necessary. They just leave a bad taste in your mouth like medicine. So, but when he says that when something is good, it points towards his God, I'm like, that seems like a little bit of a cheap trick. Like, you're going to have to justify that a little more to make that palatable to somebody who has a deeper symbolic understanding than like angels good, demons bad.
Traps you. And that's what Dante, for example, tries to show in his Divine Comedy, which is that, you know, anything that is not aiming up and always kind of giving itself up towards higher and higher goods can become a vice. And that's what we see in the Philokalia. You know, it's like the vices and the virtues are basically the same thing, that depending on how they're treated will either be something like a, you know, angelic transport towards God, or a demonic kind of rule over you. And so it's more than that. It's not just virtues. Obviously, it is actual agencies that can rule over you. But I think that to help secular people, using the language of virtues is a way to at least help them see a little bit through this, so they don't think we're just like in a Marvel universe with like gods floating in the heavens that are just, you know, like this kind of weird materialist Ghostbuster type of spirituality that people, you know, immediately go to.
All right, so I'm not in that Ghostbuster Marvel world that he's talking about. I will say that I can get behind him on the objective moral thing, but I will say that I define morals in between relationships of these different forces, and also iterating well over time. I think that inserting his God with all of these attributes, if he said I was in favor of the good, I would be more on board. But when he says I'm in favor of the good, and also that good has all these different characteristics that are described in this, 50-book tome that I happen to, hold up as the pinnacle of all revealed truth to me. That to me is dishonest. Now, furthermore, when he talks about these things having external control, like tyrants over you, I think you're blaming these forces for people acting at them out in an inappropriate or irrational way. So if you have chocolate cake, that's great. But if you eat chocolate cake until you puke, don't blame that on the cake. That's entirely 100% the fault of the humans. And one thing that I've found with this sort of Manichaean good to bad scale theology, that's very like culture centered, very light centered, light against darkness type of vibe, yin against yang as opposed to yin and yang, sort of interpenetrating each other, is that it tends to give people a way to justify their shortcomings by saying that the demon did it. It gives this universal scapegoat of the evil or the bad or the foreign. And I know that his thinking is a little more nuanced than that, but people fall into this so easily when they're presented with a clear moral dichotomy. Because morality is a moving target, and that doesn't mean it's arbitrary. I'm not moral relativist by any stretch of the imagination, but like, you have to define these things in terms of their context, and you can't just have this sort of simple moral landscape where you're up on a mountain looking down at everyone. That's not helpful to people.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And part of what has interested me, since it's now become something of a buzzword for certain people, but I really remember the intense experience of having, been a Christian, a believing Christian, and then in a very short period of time entering into what you might call a re-enchanted world, where all of these things which formerly would have an intuition of implausibility had exactly the inverse intuition, so that, before, if I read a typological pattern in history, I would say, oh, someone's fudging the details.
Yeah.
And afterwards, if I read a typological pattern in history, that's like, oh, well, this is more likely to be true than not, because this is just the way the world works.
I'm not sure what he means by typological pattern of history, but so people can be fudging the details, and the world can still have these memorable archetypes that structure people's minds. People remember things in the shape of their minds. So when you're reading history, you're remembering it in the shape of the human mind. The shape of the human mind is this landscape that they're attempting to elucidate here, albeit from their very limited Christian perspective.
So what you just said there reminded me of one of those questions that I've had for a long time, which is, in a lot of circumstances, why does the occult, quote unquote, seem to work? And let me just kind of throw a theory at you and then see what you have to say.
Yeah.
So my idea about this, if you just think about what the occult is, it works through speech, incantations, and you use incantations to alter and change things. So, God makes the world through the word. He's speaking throughout the 6 creation days. Then he makes man in his image, i.e. man is the speaking creature. God speaks to man. Man can speak back to God, in other words. And then man reconstitutes and changes the world through that speech. Well, I think what the occult is, or at least a lot of it really is it takes that principle, that nature, that human beings are tied to the world in such a way that their speech will alter and change things, and it severs it from its archetype, the supernature, which is the basis for its existence.
Okay, so I'm going to let him go on for a minute, but I just want to make a couple points here, because firstly, what he's talking about when he's talking about occult is particularly some form of ritual magic. I know he probably doesn't understand to call it that, but the word occult literally just means hidden. So everything they're talking about now is hidden relative to somebody who doesn't know it. It's hidden relative to somebody who doesn't understand it. Until 1870 or so, Charles Darwin was a cult. because it was unknown, it was hidden. He learned it, in a sense, by examining the finches. So what he's talking about here is not the occult per se. He's talking about magic. And when he's talking about, God gave man, the ability to speak, that's broadly in line with Hermeticism and what is the idea that mind can alter reality is just a truism of anybody who understands this stuff. This being said, when he refers to this super archetype, no. So again, this has to do with cause and effect and iterated games. Basically, the problem with when people get bad results doing magic, they get bad results because they don't understand the symbol set. It's not because it's severed from some unifying source that knows everything. That's bullshit. The thing that makes people fail at magic when they're doing this kind of thing is they're fundamentally not capable of grasping what's going on, so they're doing something shallow. But anyway, I want to get further into his explanation. I want to see exactly how much he knows about this, because it's curious.
And so what is going on in the occult versus what is going on in Christian prayer? Well, in a certain way, there's an analogy between the two, in that both are trying to influence the world in one way or another. When I'm praying for someone to get well, I'm submitting the will to God, but I am trying to get them well by the means of prayer. And I think what happens in prayer is we take our will, our intentions, our desires, and we seek to affect them in the world, but we always bring them through the crucified Christ, so that we say, not my will, but thy will be done. And what that does is it perfects our intentions so that they can be realized with the maximum goodness. Whereas if a person does not transmit their will through Christ, this is incredibly dangerous, because they say, oh, I want more money. But they don't have a sufficient understanding of the nature of what money is and everything else with which it is connected, so that when they realize their intentions in the world without transmitting them through the Logos, who is the archetype of all things, they get all this other stuff along with it that they weren't expecting, because they don't have the comprehensive knowledge of the nature that the Logos himself has.
There's a fair bit of truth in this, actually. But there's also a fair bit of nonsense. So when he's talking about filtering your will through this symbol that he thinks represents the good. Well, firstly, I'm not so sure about all that. But secondly, because there is no super archetype. There is no, the source of being created everything. So let's say that, for argument's sake, when the Big Bang happened, everything was created. So the Big Bang, the creation source, does not necessarily have a nature. That's like saying white light has a color. It doesn't. It's all the colors sort of melded into one. So you can't purify something by sort of running it through the ground of creation, which is why you use the symbol, the icon of this man on a cross, who you believe was the perfect guy who was also the ground of being and whatnot. There's this whole thing that they do where they assume that there's this transcendent, immutable good that you can just filter everything through, but reality is a lot more complex than that. And so you might, having good intentions might, help you with those negative consequences, but what was more likely to happen is that your naivety is going to be slapped down. So, because you know what they say about good intentions.
So I think when you look at, the occult and the ceremonial nature of it, in a certain way, it is a parody of the liturgy, because the liturgy is where we rule over the world. That is where we enter into Christ's throne room. And it looks like that. But even for a person who doesn't believe in God or Christ, even for people who are interested in practicing it, there's something creepy about it. There's something that's wrong.
You remember what I said about neurolinguistic programming and people being Christians shitting the bed when it comes to occultism? Yeah, so his So here's the thing: Christianity is a solar religion. Their temple is set up in a solar fashion. The symbol of the sun is a circle with a dot in the middle. That dot is you. The circle is the wall of your city, so to speak. And everything outside that circle is not where the light is. Think of The Lion King. The Lion King is a solar movie. It's based on Egyptian religion, which Jewish religion and therefore Christianity came out of. Simba is Horus. His father is Osiris. Scar is Set. And I believe the toucan or the baboon is Thoth or something. In fact, probably both of them are. The eyes of the king and the shaman and whatever. So, because Thoth was actually depicted as both an ibis, which is very much like a toucan, and a baboon. So that actually makes perfect sense. Regardless, Mufasa is a solar symbol, the Lion King, Leo, right? And he says, everything the light touches is your kingdom. What about over there? The elephant graveyard, the domain of Saturn. And, he's got all the little Nazi hyenas going around because Hitler is liberal Satan. And so this is this weird place where you've got a modern Christian culture which bastardizes the idea of Saturn, which I remember I said was a malefic entity. Basically, it's very light focused. It's like, we are the light, we are the paladins, we are the Templar at the center of the cross. The cross is also a solar symbol because it represents the heart chakra. If you lay a cross over your body, it crosses over the heart chakra. And for complicated reasons, the heart is also a solar symbol. This is why Jesus is always touching his heart and whatnot, and all the emphasis on blood. Regardless, this very light-focused thing has some truth to it. It's how the individual sees their world and their society. But just because you see something a particular way does not mean that's the way it is. Because the world does not look like the world is not a solar world. You are not... the world is not set up where you have the light side and the dark side. This is a cartoon of reality. It's a bastardization of symbolism. Because you're looking at things from the solar symbol rather than realizing that the sun and Saturn, the good guy and the bad guy, the gold and the black, the light and the dark, the yin and the yang, run down your heart. The center of your heart. Everybody's heart. So if you are the type of person who's been brainwashed by this solar religion into thinking that everything that is not your religion is creepy, then you're just going to be like, I don't know, I just feel like it's creepy. And you're never going to understand what's really going on in this world of symbols.
I think that C.S. Lewis talks about that. When he was a younger man interested in the occult, not a Christian. Something was just off about it.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be detached from its actual end.
Could it be maybe C.S. Lewis was doing the occult wrong? Now, I think C.S. Lewis is a great author. The Screwtape Letters is actually one of my favorite books because it does sort of give an account of this very sort of surreptitious solar religion. And C.S. Lewis was a person who was not afraid to delve into what he thought was the unknown darkness. So I commend him for that. But this is kind of like, to me, like a kid who has a nightlight, and he's afraid to go out because there's monsters in the closet. And there are some monsters in the closet, but the correct way to deal with these things is not to be like a holy Templar. All you're going to get is ridicule from that world if you go in as this conquering knight. You're going to get ridiculed. And if you really want to understand the symbolic world, you have to come in as a foreigner. You have to accept the view of the stranger and realize, oh, I have a worldview. I have been brainwashed by solar religion. I don't know what's going on in this world anymore. And you have to sort of embrace that curiosity. And if you don't embrace that curiosity, then you're always going to be a foreigner in the symbolic world.
Yeah, I think your insight is absolutely right. That's what it is. So the way to kind of understand it is, for normal people to think about this, is that the idea that you use ritual, language, and incantation in order to modify reality is actually something that you do every day all the time, right? It's like if I ask my contractor and I signed a contract with my contractor to build my house, I'm using language, meaning, and ritual in order to get my house built.
True facts.
And so I'm not building my house, right? Someone else is doing my will for me through an incantation and a ritual signing of a document, so that the contractor will then build my house for me, right? So it's something that we actually do all the time. So first of all, we have to be a little cautious about freaking out too much, like, about some of this stuff, right? But we should freak out, because the difference between me signing a contract with my contractor to build my house and an occultist is that the occultist is conscious, spiritually conscious of the mechanisms by which things manifest themselves in the world. He understands that you are invoking certain principalities and certain realities in order to get things done in the world, but they are trying to utterly weaponize spiritual principles in order to get their will to be done by ignoring the way in which it connects to the highest good and to God, right? And so the truth is that sometimes I'm doing that all the time in my life now, right? It's like I'm sinning all the time because I'm hungry and I want to eat, and so I'll ask my son to go to the store and get me a chocolate bar or whatever, and in that way I'm doing all that stuff, but it's kind of unconscious. It's not great, but it's kind of unconscious. But when you become conscious of it, then the sin becomes much greater, because you know what you're doing, you know what type of action you're posing, and what type of, let's say, misdirected power that you're using in order to accomplish your goals. And that's why, like you said, that's why it ends up looking more ritualized. That's why it ends up being more like liturgy, because it's people that are more aware of the mechanisms of reality, and because of that should be more, let's say, more aware of how they should ultimately, participate in a true liturgy, which is submitting their will to God, and then through that, submitting their will and the wills of things around them to God, so that God's will can transform everything. But it's hard because people ought to think like, well, why would that work? Like, why would, saying some incantation, why would, doing some procession work? And it's only because they don't understand that they do it all the time, and just because they can recognize the mechanical causes that is bringing about the change, that somehow now they believe in it. But when a politician, let's say, makes a kind of statement on television about what needs to happen, or some kind of thought leader, and then it happens in the world, they are not aware of the mechanical causes by which it's happening. They don't know who's going to instantiate it or who's going to make it happen, but it still changes the world. And so it's those types of understanding that the occultists are trying to weaponize towards their will. And in a stranger way, and in a more subtle way, it's something similar to that we understand that if we address our prayers to God and we submit our will to God, then the greatest transformation for the greatest good is happening as we're doing that.
Okay, so I like Johnathan Pageau a lot more than the Seraphim Hamilton guy. I think that's probably because Seraphim Hamilton is younger and he still hasn't gotten time to sort out all this stuff yet. Now, the funny thing is, I can see Johnathan Pageau struggling with the similarities between, for instance, Christian ritual of like drinking Christ's blood and eating his body and the bread and wine or whatever. He's beginning to see that the truth that what he called occultism, but what is really magic, is the Bible and Christianity are full of magic. Now, he somehow conflates consciousness of what they're already doing with sin. And it's like, dude, I thought you were the Logos guy. If you are doing this stuff all the time, drinking your God's blood and eating his body in this church weekly, then, like, what are you talking about? The idea that you're doing it all the time, but you're unconscious of it, isn't being unconscious and ignorant a greater threat then, like, let's say everybody's walking around with a gun in their pocket or a grenade in their pocket, and which they are. Everybody has this immense power that they very rarely tap into. So you're walking around with a hand grenade in your pocket, and most people have no idea that it's there at all. And they're just sort of willy-nilly running around, like, spraying this high-powered thing in their pocket. They don't even know why things are happening. They're just blindly running around doing dumb shit all the time with this powerful thing. So what exactly is his intention here? Is he trying to say, by making this video, that yes, everybody has, like, he's telling people, you have a live hand grenade in your pocket, but the morally correct thing to do is to act like it doesn't exist. Be unconscious. Like, how are you going to look at your audience with a straight face and say, you have to be unconscious of this immensely powerful gift you have? That, by the way, I'm just talking about willy-nilly freely here. So, but it's creepy. Don't do it. And it's like, the blatant hypocrisy here is quite... I wish it wasn't what I would expect from Christians, but it is what I expect. Now, I will agree with him on one point here, which is that if you are callously and cynically doing something for a short-sighted whim, it's gonna snap back at you pretty damn hard. Because if you're not, but this is, you can look at this by taking into account long-term iterations, like I was talking about. So if I say I want money, but I don't say I want money and I want to attain it in a legal way, well, guess what might happen? You might find somebody's credit card on the ground, and then you go to like a McDonald's and you run that credit card and you buy all your stupid Big Macs, and then the cops show up. This is what... So when you realize that your linguistic intent has power, then it's kind of like you're facing a genie. You're talking to a genie. And he does make some good points about you want to use that power for good. You don't want to be a dick when you understand that your words and actions have more agency than a materialist would have you think. This being said, there's nothing wrong with being conscious of your power. The only thing wrong is being conscious and then being cruel and sort of like capricious, and cynical about it, and not having regard for others. But this is just basic human ethics. There's more I could get into here about sort of like how Christians and atheists see the world and all this, and their views on ethics. Basically, the atheist makes the mistake of thinking there is no agency. Ethics is just situational, or not situational, what's the word? Arbitrary. Ethics is arbitrary. Now, the Christian makes the opposite standpoint, because they ground all their morality in one thing, and they say, well, this is the perfect thing, but they're not clear about what exactly it is. So in a way, it's like, okay, let's say you have all these paint cans, and they're all the different circumstances and situations and agencies that you exist in, that you interact with every day. Like, there's a red one, a green one, a yellow one, all these different colors. And then you dump all the paint cans together, and you sort of swirl it around. Well, what happens? You get a meaningless smudge. Now, when I ask you to extract out the good colors from there, what would you even do? It doesn't make any sense to sort of pile all your agency into one guy and one idol, one icon, and then be like, well, there's all the moral agency, there's all the good stuff. Anything else is bad. You know, any one part of this is bad, but like this guy, he's really good. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I'm all for having an objective moral standard, but you can't pretend that it's this simple, singular thing. It's like, how would you even make that case? It doesn't make any sense. So, I'm glad that these guys are actually talking about this, because most Christians, they're so brainwashed by that quote-unquote creepiness of those quote-unquote devil worshippers, that they will just dodge this topic like it's a snake that's on fire about to bite them, which they probably have been brainwashed enough to think it is. But I'm glad that these guys actually have some nuts and they're able to talk about this stuff without shrinking down into their little light hole. But like, you have to dodge the hypocrisy. Like, you have to realize that, okay, I have this thing. Everybody does it all the time. I have two options here. I can either be conscious of it or unconscious of it. And, like, is a person with a gun who doesn't know how to use it any more moral than a person with a gun who does? It's like, at least the person with conscious intent can choose to defend himself or shoot up a school. You can make that decision to defend yourself and be a good guy who stops the bad guy. But if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't even know that this thing is a gun, you think it's a water pistol and you're going around squirting people, which most Christians are in the position of doing, like, just because they're completely blind and unconscious and, you know, they don't know the true power of what they have, like, simply put, being ignorant is not a moral virtue. So if you're going to fully believe in this magic stuff and resurrection from the dead and exorcisms and interpersonal agency and all this stuff, you're going to have to get fully on board and understand what you're doing. Because I'll tell you something else. The people who don't like you are doing it. It's like the AI problem in China, right? It's like, if we stop doing AI, guess who's going to do AI? And I don't even want to China hawk because I hate it when people do that. But my point is, foreign agency X is doing this is using this technology. And if you don't use the technology, you're not a good person by choosing to remain ignorant and weak of your true potential. That's all I'm going to say. I've realized I've been going on for more than an hour here, so I'm going to call it off right now. You know, in some ways it can be more frustrating talking to and with and about Christians, because they have a point where they're not willing to go because of the neurolinguistic programming. But the only thing that's truly heartening about these people is that they can actually have this conversation even if they're scared of it. You know, I commend these people for having scary conversations. And although I might be highly critical of them and be frustrated by them sometimes, these guys are in an infinitely better place. They're so much closer to understanding the true nature of reality than an atheist is. They're so much closer. So let me know what you thought in the comments. Until next time, I will talk to you guys later.